الهدى يا شهر الندى.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه الطيبين الطاهرين. We start with the name of Allah. We praise and thank Allah, the Exalted, for all of the endowments that He bestowed upon us, without Allah, the Exalted, being obligated to give anything. And we ask Allah to protect the nation of Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wassalam from what the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam feared for his nation. Thereafter, in the last lesson, we began talking about additional conditions for the validity of the prayer. From the book of the summary by the great Imam Al-Shaykh Abdullah Al-Harariyy rahimahullah ta'ala. We covered that directing oneself towards the Qibla is a condition for the validity of the prayer. And we mentioned why the prayer direction from North America is southeast. So if you didn't catch that, then go back and review, God willing. It's a very important matter for the validity of the prayer. One does not want to go through these acts without doing something that is valid and acceptable to Allah the Exalted. And truly, leaving out the prayer is an enormous sin by which a person would deserve Allah's punishment. And for one to not fulfill the conditions for the validity of the prayer will lead to one performing an invalid prayer, meaning that indeed they didn't pray. So let us all be very mindful of such important issues. And we mentioned about the setting in of the prayer time, that it is a condition for one to know or have a religiously viable speculation on the entrance of the prayer time. And for one to be Muslim, that the prayer is not valid from a non-believer. Thus, we don't call a Christian or a Jew or an atheist, for example, to come pray with us while they're still on their blasphemy. Rather, we invite them, calling them to Islam, to embrace the religion of all the prophets. And then if they embrace Islam, we would order them to pray and teach them, inshallah, how to perform it properly. Then the author, may Allah Ta'ala have mercy upon him, continues saying, At-tamyiz, among the conditions for the validity of the prayer is tamyiz, which is mental discrimination. He said, that is, for a child to reach a stage at which they understand when addressed and are able to answer. So the person must be mentally discriminate for their prayer to be valid. If the child was before an age of mental discrimination, like, for example, a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old who had not yet reached that state, then we wouldn't order them to pray, although it's known by many that children at this age like to imitate. But for them to imitate their parents or siblings or whoever in the act of performing the prayer is not a valid act of worship from them. So while they're at that state before mental discrimination, we do not encourage them to do this. Rather, we would have them sit on the sidelines and observe how the prayer is performed. We have them sit on the side and say, look at how they pray to them, instead of them actually performing these deeds on their own. Once the child has reached a stage of mental discrimination, then they can perform their own prayers, even if they did not complete 7 lunar years yet. Rather, their prayers would be valid. Of course, they would need to be taught exactly how to perform the prayer, its integrals and its conditions, and to know what are the invalidators as to avoid them. As for the child who completes 7 lunar years of age, as we mentioned before, the guardian of the child would be obligated, whether it was the father, mother, grandfather, or grandmother, to order the child to pray and to secure their education in what pertains to the necessary matters of the prayer upon reaching that age. And when they complete 10 lunar years, then the guardian would hit them for not praying. As for the child who has completed 7 lunar years of age, but is not yet mentally discriminate, then they are not ordered to pray because, as we mentioned, mental discrimination is a condition for the prayer's validity that they have not yet fulfilled. Then the author, may Allah Ta'ala have mercy on him, said, to deem the prayer an obligation when it is obligatory. Thus, had an individual taken it upon himself to perform one of the 5 daily prayers, for example, while deeming it in his mind as merely an optional matter or a recommended act, not an obligation, then his prayer would not be valid. Then he said, for one not to deem any of the prayer integrals recommended. And as we will eventually cover, God willing, the prayer has 17 integrals according to the numbering of some of the scholars. And some scholars use a different methodology while still considering the same actual individual parts, but numbering them differently. And so they came to a different final number. The prayer having these 17 integrals, it is necessary, it's a condition for the validity of the prayer, that the praying person would not deem any of these 17 matters as merely optional. If they deemed any of these integral matters of the prayer as optional, then their prayer would not be valid. However, if a person learned that the prayer has obligatory parts and recommended parts, and he didn't in his mind deem any of the obligatory parts as sunnah, as merely recommended, and then he performed the prayer fulfilling the necessary conditions and integrals, then his prayer would be valid. One thing to go back upon when we mentioned about the prayer time, it's important to know that if a person did not have knowledge of the prayer time, nor did they have a religiously acceptable speculation that the prayer time is in, then if they pray the obligatory prayer, their prayer would not be valid, even if it happened to fall within the prayer time. Then the author, may Allah Ta'ala have mercy upon him, said, to cover with what conceals the color of the skin the entire body of the free woman except the face and hands, and to cover the area between the navel and knees of the male, free or not, and the female slave from all sides except underneath. So, when the person wants to pray, they need to cover the awrah, the unlawful nakedness. The unlawful nakedness for a free woman is her whole body, save her face and her hands. And this unlawful nakedness includes her ears, and it includes the patch of hair around the nausea, this forelock, and it includes the under chin, the skin underneath that's between her chin and her neck. This is also included in the unlawful nakedness. So this must be covered for the prayer's validity. Also, as far as the hand is concerned, this would be what's past the wrists. So from the woman shouldn't have part of her forearm here exposed during the prayer. Also, according to the Shafi'i school, the woman's foot is also part of the awrah, so she must make sure that the foot remains covered throughout the prayer. The way that the awrah would be covered is by the color of the hair and skin being concealed in a way that the brown skin could not be distinguished from white skin from behind it. So whatever the individual covered with, whether it was like, fabric, etc., then it would need to conceal the color of the hair and skin, as mentioned, from the normal distance of conversation. So it wouldn't be a very fine and thin fabric, for example, through which a person could distinguish brown skin from white skin from a normal distance of conversation. Some of the pants that some people may wear, like some grades of fine white linen, fine meaning thin, not necessarily of high quality, would not really conceal the color of the hair and skin as described. Likewise, some scarves that women wear are very thin in that you could actually see the hair and see the ears through them from a normal distance of conversation. So one would need to be very mindful about these matters when covering up. The woman must cover her body from every direction except underneath. So her aura would be covered from above, and it would be covered from all sides. And however, if it was the case that she wore a prayer garment, for example, that covered her whole body except her face and hands from every direction except underneath. However, if one was somehow underneath her, they could look up and see part of that unlawful nakedness, then her prayer would be valid. But of course, she needs to remain covered in every position. So, when she bows, her garment should not move in a way that exposes some of what must be covered. And likewise, when she's in the prostration and in every position within the positions of the prayer. The woman, like everyone else who performs the prayer, when they make sujood, they must put a part of their unexposed forehead on the ground. So if a woman was wearing a garment and it covered her head to the extent where none of her forehead was exposed, or what she put on the ground was between it was a part of her garment that moves with her as she moves, then that would not be a valid sajda. That would not be sufficient for the validity of her sujood. So one would be mindful about these matters when covering. As for the free or enslaved male, his aura is what is between his navel and his knees. The scholar said that the navel and the knees themselves are not a part of the unlawful nakedness. However, one must cover a part of the navel and a part of the knees out of al-ihtiyat, meaning out of precaution, so that there would be certainty that all what must be covered is covered. Likewise, what they cover with needs to, like we mentioned for the woman, conceal the color of the hair and skin in a way that the brown skin would not be could not be distinguished from the white skin from behind it from a normal distance of conversation. Likewise, they must cover this part of their body from every direction except underneath, like we mentioned for the woman, so that their aura would not be seen from above or from any of the sides. However, if someone was standing underneath them and looked up and saw, for example, their upper thigh, etc., this would not invalidate the prayer. This would not deem their prayer invalid. Likewise, the person would be mindful that some garments, if one had a wide opening at the neck and they weren't covered underneath it in a way that would keep what's between their navel and knees covered, then depending on what position they might be in, they may become exposed as some part of the prayer. And the female slave, the owned slave woman, her unlawful nakedness in the prayer is similar to the unlawful nakedness of the man. meaning that had a slave woman prayed wearing an izar, this garment that covers what's between the navel and knees, and it covered her from every direction except underneath, then her prayer would be valid, similar to how the man's prayer would be valid. But this is not an indication that the slave woman would go out in public, for example, with her breasts exposed or the like. Likewise, or we mentioned what was talked about, that it would be covered from every direction except underneath. So with that, inshallah, we'll move on into the next section, which is the invalidators of the prayer. The author, may Allah Ta'ala have mercy on him, said, the prayer is invalidated by speaking in as much as 2 letters or a single letter which carries a meaning, unless one forgets and the statements uttered are few. Thus, among those matters that would invalidate the prayer is for one to speak what is considered the speech of the people. So, not including that is reciting Quran in the prayer, or making dhikr in the prayer, or making dua, supplication in the prayer, as long as that supplication did not involve al-khitab, as long as that supplication didn't involve addressing a person. So one will leave that out. This invalidator of the prayer, among what pertains to it is that the person would know that this speech is prohibited in the prayer. Thus, had a person been a new Muslim who did not yet acquire the knowledge pertaining to these issues, or he was not a new Muslim, but he grew up in an area far away from the people with knowledge of these matters, and they spoke during the prayer due to their ignorance of the prohibition of that, then their prayer would not be deemed invalid. Thus, from this, a person can understand that once you have a new Muslim that you're teaching how to pray, and maybe you're standing beside them, coaching them on their first prayer, for example, and you're telling them what to do, and they don't know that they can't talk, that if they mention something to you, you don't have to tell them their prayer is invalid. Rather, you would just inform them not to do that and to continue the prayer without talking this type of speech. As for the amount of speech that would invalidate the prayer, it would be even 1 letter if the letter itself contained a meaning. As for 1 letter that contains no meaning, this does not invalidate the prayer. The speaking 1 letter that contains a meaning invalidates the prayer if the person is knowledgeable of its prohibition. He remembers that he's praying, and this letter that he uttered was not due to being overcome by the likes of coughing or sneezing, etc. Any 2 letters, even if they do not contain a meaning, said intentionally while one remembers that they are praying and they weren't ignorant of the prohibition of that, would invalidate the prayer. An example of 1 letter carrying a meaning is like what the Sheikh mentioned, the expression ri, or fi, or qi. This in Arabic, all 3 of these letters, as I recited them for you, are commands that have complete meanings. They have meanings. So for a person to utter these words while remembering that they're praying, and it came out intentionally without being ignorant of the prohibition, would invalidate the prayer. As for 2 letters, if a person, for example, said hel or bel, yani not from a verse in the Quran, for example, or they said 1 letter with an extension, like saying or ba, because that extension gives it the value of 2 letters. So a person would be mindful to avoid those, doing that in the prayer. As for the person who forgot that they were praying, then if they said what is considered a small amount of speech, which would be 6 common statements or less, and they said that while forgetting that they were praying, then their prayer would not be invalidated. And the Shaykh gave an example of what is considered a little speech, a little amount of speech, when he said that if someone said, go to the store, get me some bread, bring it back, and put it in such and such a place, while forgetting that they're praying, then their prayer would not be invalidated. However, if a person spoke a lot of speech during the prayer, even if they were forgetting of it, forgetting that they were praying, then their prayer would be invalidated. And Allah the Exalted knows best. Walhamdulillah wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa ashabihi at-tayyibin at-tahirin. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
يا شهر الخيرات والإحسان والبركات يا رمضان